Okay, our lead-off plenary speaker this morning, by the way, I failed to introduce myself, Rick Cruz, Department of Agronomy and Director of the Iowa Water Center. More important, our lead-off presenter this morning is Dr. Chris Anderson. Chris, I think grew up in Iowa, right? No. Wrong right away. And get this, I'm a soil scientist. You know who comes up here and talks about soils? Pat Sauer, who is a floodwaters person. So I've got 2 strikes against me so far, right? Okay, so whatever else I say about Chris, you're going to doubt it anyway. Or probably should. Where are you from? Texas. Okay, I didn't know that. Anyway, Chris got his master's and PhD at Iowa State University in ag meteorology. He's a research professor in the Department of Agronomy right now and is currently the associate director of the Climate Science Initiative. His focal point work right now could probably be considered climate risk analysis. He's been involved with EPA, Iowa Highway Boards, and a variety of other groups. He is a man for all hours. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
You got everything you need there? Okay, so you heard that I'm the climate guy, but really what I like to talk about is water. But before I get into water, I do want to read the forecast for you tomorrow. Tuesday for Ames Municipal Airport. Rain or freezing rain before 1, then a chance of snow. Windy with a southwest wind 13 to 18. Winds could gust as high as 34. But little or no ice accumulation, so that's good news. And now I want to encourage you to stay late tomorrow, despite the weather. I think the federal session that we're going to have tomorrow afternoon is really a unique opportunity. I've been involved with flood risk mitigation for a few years, probably since about 07 or 08, on more not as a climate scientist computing flood risk, but on communicating and understanding how to implement climate information in flood risk. And the step that's being taken by this executive order is to change the way federal projects consider flood risk. Up until now, they've only considered historical data in determining their flood risk. And with this executive order going forward, they will try to accommodate, or they will be required to use future risk of floods. So this requires some approach for dealing with how future floods might look. And I really encourage you to come in during the public listening session. This is the very first one in the entire nation that they're holding. And it's literally an opportunity for you to have a voice that goes from your mouth right into the White House. So it's a big change, and it's one that you can help shape. And I really do encourage you to come and do that. I guess there might be like a screen thing I need to push here. Function screen or something. Okay. So like, you got 1 strike, you got a single, you got 1 strike taken away. Foul ball. You didn't strike out yet, foul ball. All right. So, like I said, I do climate science, but really my interest is in water. Dating back to the mid-90s, the climate science work I have done has all involved rain. And for the first 10-ish years of my research career, it involved how do we use models to compute rain forecasts. And since about 07, it's been much more about how do we get the forecast or the climate data information appropriately into water management decisions. And so today what I want to talk about is a particular water management approach that I think is really critical for Iowa going forward, but one that is just very at its nascent stages of figuring out how to implement in Iowa. And I want to build a case for how this can be made a more widely adopted practice and why we should do that. So here is an irrigation pond in Iowa, and it's being filled with, this winter, right now, this picture was actually taken just a bit before Christmas. It's being filled with drainage water. Yeah. Is this okay? Are we all right now? Yeah. So this is drainage water that's filling in this winter, this irrigation pond in Iowa. And what I really want you to notice about it is outside of the pond, you can see a lot of black soil. This is an irrigation pond that's being built not for sandy soil, not to take very low productivity soil and raise it up to a standard that it would be competitive. But this is already really good soil that's producing very good yields of corn. So this particular practice, this irrigation, water capture for irrigation practice, is being used on about 300 acres of this highly productive soil, with the goal of expanding it to covering 750 acres eventually. And I want to use it as an example to tell you today why there are a handful of farmers around the state doing this, and why I think there should be many, many more who could follow suit and implement it quickly. So the main reason is what this system has at its heart. I think at heart, this system resonates with a long-standing Midwestern principle. And that principle is waste not, want not. Waste not, want not is something that our grandparents, I am from Texas, but my grandparents are from Minnesota, from the Midwest. Waste not, want not is something that our grandparents lived by. It's probably an idea that goes all the way back to the homesteaders when they first came here. In this particular system, drainage water, rather than being moved into a stream, it's not wasted. It's stored, and so is its nutrient content. Its nutrient content is not wasted either. So in so doing, this waste not, want not system fundamentally changes the connection between yield and water quality in Iowa. So typically, yield and water quality goals are often perceived as hostile. And typically I try to find a picture to illustrate some of these concepts. But the pictures regarding what's going on between water quality and farmers and yield are not very pretty right now. It's not the kind of picture I wanted to start it off with on a Monday morning. So I have one that's a little bit more playful, I think. The goals are seen not just as hostile, but sometimes described as a battle between good and evil, almost as epic as the light side versus the dark side of the force. This narrative is playing out in the media over and over again. It started with hypoxia, and now we have lawsuits from the city of Des Moines. On one side, you'll see growers who are painted as small business owners who are recklessly applying nutrients to hit their maximum yield goals and become rich. And on the other side, we have the health and happiness of communities and nature at large, who are at the mercy of rivers filled with excessive nutrients, not taken up by the plants. And so basically we have something like Darth MY for maximum yield versus Jedi WQ for water quality. And these are the terms and the sorts of narratives that are being put out in the public. But that's why I think this idea of water capture and irrigation is such an important thing to do in Iowa, because a waste not and a want not system demonstrates to both sides the same thing, that they want the same thing. It shows for every farmer that implements this that the farmer wants every dollar of nutrient applied to be taken up by plants rather than lost to the rivers and streams. It is in the best interest of every farmer to not lose that money down the river. It really is. And they really want to do that. It also shows the desire of everyone downstream because they live off the plants that the farmers grow. And so I think it's, at its heart, a system that really needs to be a part of Iowa's agricultural landscape. The way I think about it is, in a system where nutrients are not wasted, clean water is not wanting. And in this kind of system, it captures dissolved nutrients and reapplies it until all of it has been consumed by plants. But in so doing, it also dissolves the social hostility that we see out there. So to me, this sounds like a great path forward, but it leaves the question of how well does this system actually work? Well, in 1989 and 1990, there was a test plot in Iowa. This was run by Stuart Milvin, who was on faculty at Iowa State University, and he put together or implemented a patented sub-irrigation version of this kind of waste not, want not sort of system. Here they have tile drainage that was installed to control the water depth at about 4 feet in the soil. And in between the tile lines, but above them, they have some return sub-irrigation pipes that were installed at about a foot depth. And that allowed the water to be redelivered right at the root level and filter down through the roots. This was implemented on a small test plot, about 4 acres, that has now been developed by the city of Ankeny. But the soil at that site was really good, typical Midwestern soil, or Iowa black soil. It was a Clarion Nicollet Webster soil. The project was funded in 1987 by the Iowa legislature, and it had the long-term goals to profitably produce high crop yields while capturing and recycling shallow groundwater, to minimize surface and groundwater contamination associated with high yield crop production, and to improve wetland and wildlife habitat. Those sound like very familiar goals, and yet this was back in 1987. So the results from this were they were just wonderful. They were very, very promising. On the one side, you had the yield outcomes that they were looking for, and they noted in their study that these particular test plots yielded twice the Iowa average yield. They were much above the Story County yield of those years as well. Now, these were years 1989 and 1990, so they were coming right off a drought. They weren't themselves drought years, but they weren't exactly wet years like we have nowadays either. So the yield was really promising. And here we have the water quality. This water quality was measured in the reservoir itself, but that's the lower black line. And it was measured in the subsurface drainage tiles as well. And what you can see is as you get to the right of this plot, the lines dip down very precipitously. This begins about day 152. The reservoir goes from a nitrate concentration of about 14 down to 8, and by the end of the year it actually drops down to 3. And you can also see in the drainage water, the subsurface drainage water, a fall at the same time. And there was some question as to what was the cause of this, but it is really good timing with the growth and greening up and grain fill of the corn that this system was feeding. And so one interpretation would be that the corn was able to take the nitrogen out of the water that was recycling into the fields and use it to grow the corn. So this was a very promising result back in the early 1990s. And I know that there are people who still remember this test and who are continuing to advocate for these types of sub-irrigation systems across the state. But it really didn't exactly take off. It's not like you see a lot of this when you drive around the state. Whether you're driving on a highway or a back road or a gravel road, you don't really see this kind of system and ponds all over the place. And so with a promising technology like this, you wonder why wouldn't this have happened? Well, I think, with technology, whether you're talking about drainage technology or iPhone technology, whatever, timing is really important. Timing is everything. And in 1989 and 90, of course, we were just coming off the 88 drought. I think there are a lot of farmers who are just trying to survive, and investing in new technology just wasn't in the cash flow budget at all. But I think there's also a deeper issue with this whole technology, and that is irrigation is never really seen for production benefit. It's always been seen as a drought risk tool. It's definitely seen outside of Iowa as a way to deal with warm conditions, dry conditions, to bring states who can't produce like Iowa up to the standards that Iowa produces. And I think in Iowa, in Nebraska, and Kansas, it's still seen primarily as a hedge against drought. Well, we have a lot of financial methods that have emerged to provide a hedge against drought. And so a technology like this can get lost if it's viewed simply as a drought hedge. And I think finally, this is on a test plot. It's very simple to manage a test plot. It doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money to put the technology on a test plot. And so the farmers who were interested in this back in the 90s, maybe it wasn't clear to them how this test translates into the farm scale, into the fields that have a lot more heterogeneity in them, a lot more variability of landscape than the test plot had. So I think it was very hard, maybe from the timing, from the stigma of it being just a drought hedge, and also just maybe it was too simple of a case study for people to really get a sense of what it could do. Nevertheless, nowadays there are variants of this demonstration at states around us. Ohio has had one of these systems in place for about 12 years, maybe a little bit longer. Missouri has had one in place for about 10 years. There's one going up in Minnesota now. And in each case, there's a definite promise of higher yield with improved environmental conditions. So the themes that came out of Melvin Stewart's work back in 1989 and 1990 still ring true in other locations that have different soil conditions, that have different economic conditions, that have different environmental conditions. The themes of higher production yield with reduced impact on the environmental conditions. So what got me interested in this, being the climate scientist, is that after the 2012 drought, I read a couple of media stories about irrigation on black soil. And this was the first I had heard of it. But I was becoming more and more interested in it based upon my climate and rainfall research. So what I started to do is ask around. I asked some of the media folks who they had talked to that were farmers, and asked the farmers if they knew other people who were doing these kinds of things. And out of that, I was able to pull together a roundtable of farmers who are practicing this and who are really interested in promoting this and moving this forward. And so what I'm going to talk about in a moment are just the ideas that came out of that first roundtable we have, and the reasons why growers, not Chris Anderson, not NRCS, not anybody else, but growers themselves would like to see this practice take off and be more widely used around the state. Before I move on to that, I want to point out it's not just that there are test plots being implemented around Minnesota and Ohio and Missouri, but they are thinking much more broadly about the Midwest adopting this technology. This paper written by Baker, who is at an ARS lab in St. Paul, went the extra step and analyzed in southern Iowa southern Minnesota, locations where they could actually put in this sort of water capture. They called it, most of them, they called restorable wetlands. So this is an area across southern Minnesota. And if you want to find the details of their analysis and where they think the benefits for water quality could come from, you can look in this paper in 2012 on water resources research. One of the things they ended their paper on was, what is the incentive for doing this? There's been a production incentive that we've seen before, but they argue that there might also be a conservation incentive. So with that, I want to move on to what the farmers were telling me at this roundtable. This was a group of about a half dozen farmers. Most of them are actually experimenting with capturing water and using it for irrigation, and a couple others were there thinking about if they were going to do that, invest in it this last fall or next fall. And so there were basically a couple things that I wanted to learn from them before I started going down the path of figuring out what Iowa State University can do to help them. The first thing is I wanted to know why. Why did they even consider doing this? What was the benefit that they could imagine? And after that, I talked about how much did it cost? And were they going to get their money back? So they talked about that quite a bit as well. And then finally, this leads into my afternoon session on this. I asked them, what can Iowa State University do to help you? So the first question is, why are they interested in doing that? Well, all of them really looked at it as a production benefit. And this kind of surprised me a little bit because, again, irrigation is mostly thought as being drought insurance. And yet these growers were looking ahead and they were saying, we don't know, what they were literally saying is, we don't know if there are technologies out there that can help us boost our yield beyond what we are doing today. It's not really clear in the marketplace to us that we're going to get the 10 bushels per acre that people are trying to sell to us with their technologies. Some of them began to realize that as they experimented with some higher population seeds, or as they just looked at the health of their current crops, that their crops were suffering from nutrient deficiencies. They felt like they were putting enough nutrients on, and what they decided was that the nutrients were there, they just weren't being mobilized. And the reason they weren't being mobilized is they didn't have the water at the right time. So based upon that thought pattern, they really truly believed, and after doing a few strip trials on their own, were convinced that they could get an additional 20 to 50 bushels per acre just by being much more in control of when their water was in their soil. So that means they invested in allowing that water to get drained to a holding facility, and then they can determine when that water gets back on the soil, and they can time it with the time that they need to have their nutrients taken up by their plants. So 20 to 50 bushels per acre, that's a pretty good improvement. And it's really only possible if you have good soil. If you have really dark soil, it has a lot of water holding capacity that allows roots to pull nutrients out of the soil. It's really only possible there. They also saw some production benefits in the sense of reducing costs. In some cases, they have reduced their nitrogen application rate. Others were already very mindful of their nutrient reduction, of their nutrient application. And in this case, it's more about nutrient efficiency than nutrient reduction. Well, when they started looking over their farm at just not whether or not they're getting yield, but just how productive their farm is. What is the return on investment on each little acre, each little meter of land that they own? You know, they recognize that there are some acres that are not very productive. And this idea of having a pond allowed them to turn those unproductive acres into very productive, into a resource for making their productive acres even more productive. So in that way, they were able to reduce some of their loss revenue, their low return on investment on some of their poorer performing land or unused land, and then turn it into a return on investment on other land. They also had a few cases where they already had drainage in place, but it was not being as effective as it could be. And the reason is the drains just didn't really have any place to go. They would fill up and the outlet would be covered. And so by redirecting it into a pond and allowing that drainage pipe to really work as it was intended to work, then they were able to have much higher yields on these lands that are getting flooded more often than they have in the past. And this is kind of a stretch, I think, but it is something that was voiced by the producers. These are producers who do want to be mindful of their nutrient approaches, of their nutrient plants. They are being considerate of how much they put on, of how much they lose. And as they look through different types of strategies that have been presented to them, this one where you capture water and apply it later was the one that they felt had the biggest yield potential, the yield boost potential. Other strategies were very effective, they felt, at reducing nutrient losses, but they wouldn't necessarily provide them. It wasn't clear to them that there would be a yield production or a production boost from implementing those practices. So this is what growers themselves are saying about why they're experimenting with this approach. well, actually I had one more. I forgot about this one. But also when you have water available during the summer, if it's a little bit dry and a little bit warm, that water allows you to do other things on your land. You can enter different markets possibly. You can enter a vegetable market. You might be able to use water. Maybe it's not actually, you have to be careful with the drainage of your water if you're using it for organic, but some people have considered, if I have water available all the time, I could do organic farming and maybe enter a higher margin market. Some folks in the group were already working with white corn, and this provided their white corn production more stability and allowed them to be in that market. So there are a lot of good reasons, smart reasons, that these farmers are thinking about using this approach. It involves improving their business, and by making a good business choice, they're also making a good environmental choice. So here's the big question. Who can afford to do this, and what does it cost to do it? So the numbers are still a little murky, but what they were finding is, depending upon how much excavation you had to do in order to build your pond, the cost of building the pond and implementing the irrigation ranged between $1,500 and $2,500 an acre. And so if you look at what they're saying their yield improvement was, which is about 20 bushels an acre for corn, we didn't talk much about soybean, but for corn, or 50 bushels per acre, if you're at $4 a bushel corn, then in the case of a 20 bushel per acre increase, if you're up around $1,500 cost, it takes about 18 years to get that money back. If you're more like 50 bushels per acre, then it takes about 8 years to get that money back. So it's less than a decade. It's much sooner than maybe some people would think that irrigation and pond investments would pay off. But these guys are very clever. I don't intend to use the word guys in a derogatory way. They literally just were guys. There weren't any women in the room. But these guys were clever, and they came up with other ways to make that payoff time shorten itself. One is, as I described earlier, they took land that was previously unprofitable and put it into production, and that changed the way that the investment spread over the value of their land. And while they were doing the excavation, they found ways to maybe sell their soil. There are folks who sell black soil for lots of different reasons, and they were able to find that market and recoup some of the cost of building the pond, and then that way it shortened the payoff time. And then finally, something that we talked about only a little bit is this idea of green credits. There are credit markets out there for nutrient capture. There are credit markets out there for carbon mitigation offsets. And a technology like this can allow farmers to engage in those markets as well. So I'm going to finish off here in a couple minutes, but before I do, my climate scientist has to come out and weigh in a little bit on why this is really interesting technology to me. These are 4 maps from historical data. In the lower right-hand corner is the source. McCabe is the lead author in 2004, and this is from the National Academies. It's a paper published by the National Academies. And the idea was, from 1900 to 1999, there were combinations of Atlantic and Pacific temperature phases that impacted how frequently drought occurred. And if it were not true, we have 4 cases, and the drought frequency in each case would be 25%. That would be kind of a blue color, a light blue color on every single plot. But that just isn't the case. You can see a lot of red, you can see a lot of dark blue. The dark blue color means that the combination of ocean conditions had a lower frequency of drought, anywhere from 10 to 25% rather than the 25%. And the red means a higher frequency of drought, anywhere from 30 to 45%. So these data were collected from 1900 to 1999, and what pattern we've been in recently is in the lower right-hand corner. And what you can see is that the data that does not really include any of the period that we're in historically show that the Southwest and into Texas would have a higher frequency of drought. And in fact, we have heard a lot about drought in Texas and in California and in Arizona over the last 10 to 15 years. And so in this case, it's not a forecast that we provided, but what we have seen is basically that history has repeated itself. In the past, under these warm conditions in the Pacific and warm conditions in the Atlantic, the Southwest was favored for drought. And today, when we had those conditions, the Southwest was favored for drought. And not so much around Iowa, especially Northwest Iowa was not so favored for drought under these conditions, and it's been very wet in Northwest Iowa. So some of these, some of what has happened before, we have seen again. Well, where we are headed is up to the upper right-hand corner. The warm Atlantic is not going to go away. It changed over in the 1990s, and it stays warm for about 30 years historically. But the Pacific is likely to change over in the near term. In the past year, in fact, there are indications that it has already turned over. We're not able to predict yet whether that will stay. So the best we can do is monitor it for another year or two. And if we're convinced after another year or two that it's in that phase, then the drought frequency here in Iowa would be expected to go up to more like a 35%, or in the northwest part of the state, 40%. So what that means is, in the past 15 years or so, we've had about 2 to 3 droughts every 10 years, about 4 to 6 droughts every 20 years. But going forward, if this phase holds for the next year, we would say that over the next 20 years, rather than having 4 to 6, we would be looking more like about 8 or 9 droughts is what we'd expect to have in the next 20 years. And this is complicated because I've talked about the warm Atlantic. There are multiple reasons for the Atlantic to be warm. One is that it normally warms for a 30-year period, and then it'll cool off for a 30-year period. The other is that there's been a lot of greenhouse gases that have emitted radiation, and the ocean has absorbed this. What happens in the Midwest is that the warm conditions in the Caribbean Sea into the Gulf of Mexico, and even farther back to the North Tropical Atlantic off the equator there, that water comes into our area by a low-level wind field, and it provides the most of the rainfall that we receive. In fact, the estimates are that as much as 60% of our rain comes directly off of the ocean. And when the ocean is warmer, then there's more humidity. And when there's more humidity that comes up in the wind fields from the south, then the storms it interacts with have more rainfall. So we have a very complicated situation where we have now a warmer Atlantic that's providing a lot of humidity that's getting caught up in wind fields in the springtime and producing a lot of rain in our springtimes. But we may be changing over to a period because of a cool Pacific where summer drought may become more frequent. And so the year that's most like that scenario is 2013. We had a very wet spring in 2013, and we were followed in the summertime by a dry, hot summer. And if you want to take one last look at what 2013 means, on this plot in the blue, we have historical climate conditions for the spring rainfall along the x-axis and the summer temperature along the y-axis. And our future projections with climate models are in the red boxes. And so what they show is, as you go to the right, the red boxes have more spring rainfall, and as you go up, they are also hotter during the summer. And the star in this plot is 2013. And it clearly lies closer to the future projections than what we've seen in the past. So there are lots of reasons in my mind, besides just growers who are really interested in this technology, besides growers who think there's going to be a significant production benefit in this technology. There are also climate conditions that we might consider in being aggressive in promoting this technology. And so finally, I want to talk about what I think Iowa State's role can be in the near term and going forward. So one of the things that we have gathered from this network of farmers that we met with in January, and that I've since been in contact with, is a number of questions that they're just not sure how to do yet. They're not sure how to implement this practice, even though they're going ahead and giving it a try. But one of the things that this network that Iowa State University can facilitate, can do, is just basically what I'm doing here today, raise awareness. One of the growers who was at this meeting just commented and said, I didn't know so many people across the state were interested in this. He really thought he might be the only one. But the reality is I think a lot of people have thought about it. And in general, irrigation, there's more irrigation in this state than you might think. And it is getting more and more used on black soil. So I think raising awareness and allowing farmers to learn from one another is a really important role that Iowa State University can play if we can somehow facilitate a network of farmers doing this. Second of all, there are the hard questions that we need to research. And this may be research not only conducted by Iowa State University, but through a network, it might be sort of a crowdsourcing research, right? We can learn from one another quickly on this front. Some questions that have come up is, well, what exactly happens to nitrogen and phosphorus loss to the stream within the system? Remember, much of their first thoughts about this had to do with the production benefits, and they maybe haven't taken all the time yet to make all the water quality measurements that you would need to make to understand where the nutrients are going and how much of them are being lost to the rivers. Another question was, what is the cost benefit of water capture and irrigation due to improved drainage and timely water? So this idea is, what if I didn't have the capacity to apply water when I wanted to, and I have the capacity to apply the water when I want to? What is the economic benefit? What is the incremental economic benefit? What is the actual yield level we can actually attain if water isn't limiting? This came out of growers who are looking at their machine estimated yield. And they know there are strips of their really good soil that's pushing 300 bushels an acre. They know that. And they know that that soil just happens to be wetter and has had better conditions during that growing season. And they are wondering out loud, how big can it be? Just a strip? Can it be 2 strips? Can it be an entire field that does that if we have the water available? Now, getting into the actual logistical side, there are questions about, well, what nitrogen rates, what potassium rates should I actually use? If in the past, all of our field trials, all of our data have been collected under situations when water is limiting, are those recommendations valid when water isn't limiting? They don't know. They have to experiment. And then there's questions about the economies of scale. What is the minimum practical size? What is the smallest area of your field you'd want to try this in and still make a return on investment to pay for itself? Then, as you're going from that small scale up to an entire field scale, 300 acres, 700 acres, and larger, how do those costs change with the size, and how does the return on investment change with those costs? Then there are some more practical questions about how big of a hole should be built. Should we store enough water so that we have 2 inches to get through July and August? Do we need 4 inches? Do we need 6 inches? How many inches do we need to get through July and August? And then once we make it through July and August, what about next year? Should we keep some water in our pond? Should we let it dry? Should we let it get dry so we can fill it in rapidly the coming spring? Is it going to be wet every spring? Chris Anderson, climatologist, is it going to be wet? Really? Are you sure it's going to be wet every spring? I'm pretty sure it's going to be wet every spring, by the way. But they aren't necessarily, they want to fall back more often than not, just in case. And I don't blame them. So this is what Iowa State can do. I think we can build a research network. There are a couple of ways that we are doing this immediately coming out of this January meeting. One is that last week I submitted a NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant. And the idea was they already have nutrient management programs that the NRCS helps farmers to, with the costs of, and to have the technical capabilities to put it together and to implement one. And so my idea was, well, this is a group of farmers who don't have any sort of guidance documents anywhere. So we submitted a proposal to NRCS to work with this set of farmers so that they could do some strip trials using the methodology of strip trial research that Iowa Soybean Association has. And then hopefully out of all of that, there would become some guidance over the next 2 years on just what nutrient levels should be applied, when you might apply them, and all of those other factors that folks wonder about. We also wanted to validate on another set of farms, besides the folks that we had in the room in January, what the return on investment is with this approach. And we wanted to begin to diversify our systems. We wanted to look at farmers who were interested in doing this in uplands, that's higher terrain with the pond, where down below is the land that they want to irrigate. And we wanted to bring the water quality measurements to the table. That is something that many agronomists maybe haven't done at this point, with their focus being on production increases. So we have this grant that's going out for consideration. The idea is to create, from our nugget of a network, a wider network, and that would allow us to make the measurements we need and begin the peer learning process that we also need in order to make this go forward. And we also have a plan to do some of this on our Iowa State University demonstration farms. Here's the plan that they put together. These are going to be test plots on about 10 acres of land. And there are 3 aspects that they plan to test. One is for corn and soybean. They want to use irrigation. We're not building a pond quite yet. We're just starting with simple irrigation. And we'll find out if we use a traditional management plan in one part versus a high yield management plan, whether there is a consistent response and what the variability is in that response. So this afternoon I have a discussion session, and the idea of this discussion session is to continue to bring those stories forward and those questions forward that started in January with my roundtable. And actually I wanted to have the roundtable here. The growers just happen to be out of town, out of state, a long ways away in fact. So it's more of a discussion session where, first of all, I would like to explain this NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant for people who are doing irrigation, who may be already doing this. We're looking for people to be involved as part of this network. And then second of all, there are some other aspects of this roundtable discussion that I want to bring out into the public and get some feedback on. There's a lot of discussion about the permitting process and how that could actually slow down implementation and adoption of this practice. And then finally, I want to capture more questions and suggestions from growers, from other people, not just growers, on this technology. What is it about this technology that captures your imagination? What is it about this technology that needs to be proven with field data before you would feel comfortable with seeing it applied much more widely across the state? So in the end, I had that nice cartoon before. I'll end with another cartoon. The Midwest ethic of waste not, want not means that yield and water quality can get along. We actually have the same goal in mind. And rather than having a hostile picture, we can have one where we're drinking, let's just call that clean water for right now. Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, we need to set up for the incoming speaker who is still in Toledo. So in the interim of the setup time, we've had time for a couple questions.
That's right. I think that there is, but in fact, the NRCS has a watershed protection program. There are some of these projects in the southwestern part of the state, and they implemented a series of ponds that were designed to slow down water coming off a field as it was going towards the river. And so these are basically like slow drain ponds. They have a drain in them. The water goes into the pond, gets held there, and the drain slows down how quickly the water goes to the streams. So that kind of idea carries directly over to the water capture for irrigation. The only difference is, as far as I'm aware, the NRCS program has only the storage for flood protection as approved practice, or whatever the correct terminology is. These were not allowed to also be irrigation ponds. These were only meant to be watershed flood protection ponds. So you can build irrigation into it, but it comes at the expense of the people interested in the irrigation. So as far as I'm aware, that's the only program, that's a federally supported program that has water capture that would be relevant for flood protection. And that might serve as a way to, as Baker from Minnesota suggested, provide federal cost match to implement this more widely across the Midwest.
Iowa DNR, we have a program that we started with PA, and actually 2 million was involved to, instead of having conventional basins to get the runoff from EDOT into those basins, we are testing about 12 or 13 sites that they have the runoff from the EDOT goes to an area called EID, the Excessive Infiltration Basin, that the farmers try to plant. We have kind of hard time to get the grasses grow in that area because of high concentration, but with the management of solid sediment basins is getting better. But the point is that the water that goes to that infiltration basin with the pipes under it goes to another area that is the DPA, that is vegetation treatment area. So we use that water to go to the other area, and it's working. It's not 100% working, but we are trying to get them involved. ISU was involved in that, we are involved in that, and also DPA was involved in that.
Okay, so there's a water capture system for, sounds like, I don't know if denitrification is the right word, but definitely solids settling out, and you're a person that I should definitely talk to here today. Thanks for mentioning that. And there's a question down here, I think, closer. One more. Yeah. Right. So well water, so the questions have to do, 2 minutes. I'll choose one of those questions. The 3 questions were, what about the public health implications of having ponded water, a place for mosquitoes to form? The second one, there was dredging of ponds. Once you have a pond, it can fill in and it loses its effectiveness. And then the third question was, I'm sorry, what was the third? Oh yeah, surface water versus well water. My preference is that on the third question to use surface water rather than deep water, because if we're accelerating the water cycle by pulling deep water, that doesn't seem to really have the environmental benefits that I'd like to see. On the first question, it's interesting that you mentioned the mosquitoes. There's been a lot of information, a lot of discussion recently about what might become a new sort of viral epidemic from mosquitoes called chikungunya. Chikungunya. So you've heard it now. I'm not going to make you say it. Chikungunya. This is something that I learned about just last fall. It's something that was never a problem in the United States until last year. And there is an active public a PR campaign to try and raise awareness that it's not just West Nile virus that we need to worry about, but now we have chikungunya that has migrated from the Caribbean area. And if we have another hot and humid summer, that would allow for mosquito populations to be large. So as it relates to the ponds, then I'm not sure we haven't really thought about that at all. It's actually been on more the other side. If we have ponds, maybe we have habitat for other types of wildlife. Haven't really thought much about mosquitoes.